the Galveston Horror. West Indian hurricane descends upon Galveston, causing immense losses of life and property. Catastrophe unparalleled in the history of the world. A night of horrors and suffering. The frightful West Indian hurricane, which descended upon the beautiful, prosperous, and progressive, but ill-fated city of Galveston on Saturday, September 8, 1900, causing the loss of many thousands of lives and the destruction of millions of dollars worth of property, and then ravaged central and western Texas, killing several hundred people and inflicting damage which cost millions to repair, has had no parallel in history. When the gale approached the island upon which Galveston is situated, it lashed the waves of the Gulf of Mexico into a tremendous fury, causing them to rise to all but mountain height. And then it was that, combining their forces, the wind and water pounced upon their prey. In the short space of 4 hours, the entire site of the city was covered by angry waters, while the gale blew at the rate of 100 miles an hour. Business houses, public buildings, churches, residences, charitable institutions, and all other structures gave way before the pressure of the wind and the fierce onslaught of the raging flood. And those which did not crumble altogether were so injured in the majority of cases that they were torn down. Such a night of horror as the unfortunate inhabitants were compelled to pass has fallen to the lot of few since the records of history were first opened. In the early evening, when the water first began to invade Galveston Island, the people residing along the beach and near it fled to points in the city as places of refuge, taking nothing but the smaller articles in their houses with them. On and on crawled the flood until darkness had set in, and then, as though possessed of a fiendish vindictiveness, hastened its speed and poured over the surface of the town, completely submerging it, covering the most elevated ground to a depth of 5 feet, and the lower portions 10 and 12 feet. The hurricane was equally malignant, if not more fiendish and cruel, and tore great buildings and beautiful homes to pieces with evident delight, scattering the debris far and wide. Telegraph and telephone lines were thrown down, railroad tracks and bridges, the latter connecting the island and city with the mainland, torn up, and the mighty tangled mass of wires, bricks, sections of roofs, sidewalks, fences, and other things hurled into the main thoroughfares and cross streets, rendering it impossible for pedestrians to make their way along for many days after the waters and gale had subsided. 40,000 people, men, women, and children, cowered in terror for 8 long hours. The intense blackness of the night, the swishing and lapping of the waves, the demoniac howling and shrieking of the wind, and the indescribable and awful crashing, tearing, and rending as the houses, hundreds at a time, were wrecked and shattered, ever sounding in their ears. Often, too, the friendly shelter where families had taken refuge would be swept away, plunging scores and scores of helpless ones into the mad current which flowed through every street of the town, and fathers and mothers were compelled to undergo the agony of seeing their children drown with no possibility of rescue. Husbands lost their wives, and wives their husbands, and the elements were only merciful when they destroyed an entire family at once. All during that fearful night of Saturday, until the gray and gloomy dawn of Sunday broke upon the sorrow-stricken city, the entire grim death in its most horrible shapes. They could not hope for anything more than the vengeance of the hurricane, and as they realized that with every passing moment souls were being hurried into eternity, Is it at all wonderful that, after the strain was over and all danger gone, reason should finally be unseated and men and women break into the unmeaning gaiety of the maniac? Not one inhabitant of Galveston, old enough to realize the situation, had any idea other than that death was to be the fate of all before another day appeared. And when this long and weary suspense, to which was added the chill of the night and the growing pangs of hunger, was at last broken by the first gleams of the light of the Sabbath morn, the latter was not entirely welcome, for the face of the sun was hidden by morose and ugly clouds, from which dripped, at dreary intervals, cold and gusty showers. Thousands were swallowed up during the darkness, and their bodies either mangled and mutilated by the wreckage which had been tossed everywhere, left to decompose in the slimy ooze deposited by the flood, or forced to follow the waves in their sullen retirement to the waters of the Gulf. Dejection and despondency succeeded fright. The majority of the businessmen of the city had suffered such losses that they were overcome by apathy. Nearly all the homes of the people were in ruins. The streets were impassable, and the dead lay thickly on every side. All telegraph and telephone wires were down, and as miles and miles of railroad track had disappeared and the bridges carried away, there was absolutely no means of communication with the outer world except by boat. The strange spectacle was then presented of the richest city of its size in the richest country in the world, lying prostrate, helpless and hopeless, a prey to ghouls, vultures, harpies, thieves, thugs, and outlaws of every sort, its people starving, and the putrid bodies of its dead breeding pestilence. It was an absolute impossibility for anyone to form an idea of the extent and magnitude of the disaster within a week of its occurrence. The morning of Sunday, when the wind and the waves had subsided, the streets of the city were found clogged with debris of all sorts. The people of Galveston could not realize for several days what had happened. 4,000 houses had been entirely demolished, and hardly a building in the city was fit for habitation. The people were apathetic. They wandered around the streets in an aimless sort of way, unable to do anything or make preparations to repair the great damage done. The Monday following the catastrophe, Galveston was practically in the hands of thieves, thugs, ghouls, vampires, and bandits, some of them women, who robbed the dead, mutilated the corpses, which were lying everywhere, ransacked business houses and residences, and created a reign of terror which lasted until the officers in command of the force of regulars stationed at the beach barracks sent a company of men to patrol the streets. The governor of the state ordered out all the regiments of the National Guard, and various associations of businessmen also supplied men who assisted the soldiers in doing patrol duty in the city and suburbs. The depredations of the lawless element were of an inconceivably brutal character. Unprotected women, whether found upon the streets or in their houses, were subjected to outrage or assault and robbed of their clothing and jewelry. Pedestrians were held up on the public thoroughfare in broad daylight and compelled to give up all valuables in their possession. The bodies of the dead were despoiled of everything, and in their haste to secure valuables, the ghouls would mutilate the corpses, cutting off fingers to obtain the rings thereon, and amputating the ears of the women to get the earrings worn therein. The majority of the thieves and vampires belonged in the city of Galveston and were reinforced by desperadoes from outside towns like Houston, Austin, and New Orleans, who took advantage of the rush to the city immediately after the disaster, obtaining free transportation on the railroads and steamers upon a pretense that they were going to Galveston for the purpose of working with relief parties and the gangs assigned for burial of the dead. Their outrages became so flagrant and the people of the city became so terrified in consequence of their depredations that the city authorities, unable to cope with them, most of the officers of the police department having been victims of the flood, that an appeal was made to the governor to send state troops and procure the preservation of order. Captain Rafferty, commanding Battery O of the 1st Regiment of Artillery, USA, was also implored to lend his aid in putting down the lawless bands, and he accordingly sent all the men in his command who had not met death in the gale. There was some delay in getting the state troops to Galveston because so many miles of railroad had been washed away, the adjutant general being compelled to notify some companies of militia by courier, but Captain Rafferty ordered his men on duty at once, with instructions to promptly shoot all persons found despoiling the dead. Most of the vampires were African Americans, some of them, however, being white women, the latter being as savage and merciless in their treatment of the dead as the most abandoned of their male companions. The regulars were put on duty on Tuesday night, and before morning had shot several of the thugs, who were executed on the spot when found in the act of robbery. In every instance, the pockets of the harpies slain by the United States troops were found filled with jewelry and other valuables, and in some cases, notably that of one African American, fingers were found in their possession which had been cut from the hands of the dead, the vampires being in such a hurry that they could not wait to tear the rings off. On Wednesday evening, the government troops came across a gang of 50 desperadoes who were despoiling the bodies of the dead found enmeshed in the debris of a large apartment house. With commendable promptness, the regulars put the ghouls under arrest, and finding the proceeds of their robberies in their possession, lined them up against a brick wall and without ceremony shot every one of them. In cases where the villains were not killed at the first fire, the sergeant administered coup de grace. Many of the thugs begged piteously for mercy, but no attention was paid to their feelings, and they suffered the same stern fate as the rest. When the state troops arrived in the city, they took the same severe measures, and the result was that within 48 hours, the city was as safe as it had ever been. The police arrested every suspicious character, and the jails and cells of the police station were filled to overflowing. These people were deported as soon as possible and notified that if they returned, they would be shot without warning. The temper of the citizens of Galveston was such that they would not temporize in any case with those who were neither criminals or inclined to work. Every able-bodied man in town was impressed for duty in relief and burial parties, and whenever an individual refused to do the work required, he was promptly shot. By Thursday morning, all the men required had been obtained, and relief and burial parties were filled to the quota deemed necessary, and the work of disposing of the bodies of the dead, administering to the wants of the wounded, and the clearing of the streets of the debris was proceeding satisfactorily. The dead lay in the streets and vacant places in hundreds, and the heat of the sun began to have its natural effect. Decomposition set in, and the stench became unbearable. At first, an effort was made to identify the corpses, but it was soon found the work could not be proceeded with, as any delay imperiled the living. Fears entertained in regard to pestilence were speedily verified, and the people of the city were taken ill by scores. It was difficult to obtain men to perform the duty of burying the bloated corpses of the victims of the catastrophe, and consequently the city authorities ordered that the dead be loaded on barges, taken a few miles out to sea, weighted, and thrown into the water. The ground had become so water-soaked that it was impossible to dig graves or trenches for the reception of the bodies, although in many instances people buried relatives and friends in their yards and the grounds surrounding their residence. Along the beach, hundreds of corpses were buried in the sand, but the majority of the burials were at sea. By Wednesday night, 2,500 bodies had been cast into the water, while about 500 had been interred within the city limits. Precautions were taken, however, to mark the graves, and when the ground had dried sufficiently, the bodies were disinterred and taken to the various cemeteries where, after burial, suitable memorials were erected to mark their last resting place. No attempts were made at identification after Wednesday, lists being simply made of the number of victims. The graves of the buried in the sand were marked with inscriptions such as white man aged 40, white woman aged 25, and male or female child as the case might be. So accustomed did the burial parties become to the handling of the dead that they treated the bodies as though they were merely carcasses of animals and not bodies of human beings, and they were dumped into the trenches prepared for their reception without ceremony of any kind. The excavations were then filled up as hurriedly as possible, the sand being packed down tightly. This might have seemed inhuman, unfeeling, and brutal, but the exigencies of the situation demanded that the corpses be put out of the way as speedily as possible. Great difficulty was experienced in securing men to transport bodies to the wharves where the barges lay, and it was practically an impossibility to get anyone to touch the bodies of the African American victims, decomposition having set in earlier than in the cases of the whites, and had it not been that the members of the fire department volunteered their services, the remains of the African Americans would have remained unburied for a longer time than they were. Finally, however, patience ceased to be a virtue, and orders were given the guards to shoot any man who refused to do his duty under the circumstances. The result of this was at the beginning of Wednesday there was less delay in the matter of disposing of the dead. However, in spite of the activity of the burial parties, the work of clearing the streets of corpses was a most tedious one. The surviving people of Galveston did not awaken from sleep on Sunday morning, for they had not slept the night before. For many weary hours they had stood face to face with death, and knew that thousands had yielded up their lives, and that millions of dollars worth of property had been destroyed. There was not a building in Galveston which was not either entirely destroyed or damaged, and the people of the city lived in the valley of the shadow of death, helpless and hopeless, deprived of all hope and ambition, merely waiting for the appearance of the official death roll. Confusion and chaos reigned everywhere. Death and desolation were on all sides. Wreck and ruin were the only things visible wherever the eye might rest, and with businesses entirely suspended and no other occupation than the search for and burial of the dead, it was strange that the thoroughfares and resident streets were not filled with insane victims of the hurricane's frightful visit. For days the people of Galveston knew there was danger ahead. They were warned repeatedly, but they laughed at all fears. Business went on as usual, and when the blow came, it found the city unprepared and without safeguards. Owing to the stupefaction following the awful catastrophe, The people were in no condition, either physical or mental, to provide for themselves, and therefore depended upon the outside world for food and clothing. The inhabitants of Galveston needed immediate relief, but how they were to get it was a mystery, for Galveston was not yet in touch with the outside world by rail or sea. The city was sorely stricken and appealed to the country at large to send food, clothing, and water. The waterworks were in ruins, and the cisterns all blown away, so that the lack of water was one of the most serious of the troubles. Never did a storm work more cruelly. All the electric light and telegraph poles were prostrated, and the streets were littered with timbers, slate, glass, and every conceivable character of debris. There was hardly a habitable house in the entire city, and nearly every business house was either wrecked entirely or badly damaged. On Monday, there were deaths from hunger and exposure, and the list swelled rapidly. People were living as best they could in the ruins of their homes, in hotels, in schoolhouses, in railway stations, in churches, in the streets by the side of their beloved dead. So great was the desolation, one could not imagine a more sorrowful place. Streetcars were not running. No trains could reach the town. Only sad-eyed men and women walked about the streets. The dead and wounded monopolized the attention of those capable of doing anything whatever, and the city was at the mercy of thieves and ruffians. All the fine churches were in ruins. From Tremont to P Street, thence to the beach, not a vestige of a residence was to be seen. In the business section of the city, the water was from 3 to 10 feet deep in stores, and stocks of all kinds, including foodstuffs, were total losses. It was a common spectacle, that of inhabitants of the fated city, wandering around in a forsaken and forlorn way, indifferent to everything around them and paying no attention to inquiries of relatives and friends. God forbid that such scenes are enacted again in this country. It was thought the vengeance of the fates had been visited in its most appalling shape upon the place which had unwittingly incurred its wrath. It was fortunate, after all, however, that those compelled to endure such trials were temporarily deprived of their understanding, were so stunned that they could not appreciate the enormity of the punishment. Every available building in the city was used as a hospital. As for the dead, they were being put away anywhere. In one large grocery store on Tremont Street, all the space that could be cleared was occupied by the wounded. It was nothing strange to see the dead and crippled everywhere, and the living were so fascinated by the dead they could hardly be dragged away from the spots where the corpses were piled. There were dead by the score, by the hundreds, and by the thousands. It was a city of the dead, a vast battlefield, the slain being victims of flood and gale. The dead were at rest, but the living had to suffer, for no aid was at hand. In clearing away the ruins of the Catholic Orphans' Home, heart-rending evidence of the heroism and love of the sisters was discovered. Bodies of the little folks were found which indicated by their position that heroic measures were taken to keep them together so that all might be saved. The sisters had tied them together in bunches of 8, and then tied the cords around their own waists. In this way, they probably hoped to quiet the children's fears and lead them to safety. The storm struck the home with such terrific force that the structure fell, carrying the inmates with it and burying them under tons of debris. 2 crowds of children, tied and attached to sisters, have been found. In one heap, the children were piled on the sisters, and the arms of one little girl were clasped around a sister's neck. In the wreck of the home over 90 children and sisters were killed. It was first believed that they had been washed out to sea, but the discovery of the little groups in the ruins indicated that they were all killed and buried under the wreckage. Sunday and Monday were days of the greatest suffering, although the population had hardly sufficiently recovered from the shock of the mighty calamity to realize that they were hungry and cold. On Monday, all relief trains sent from other cities toward Galveston were forced to turn back, the tracks being washed away. On Tuesday, Mayor Jones of Galveston sent out the following appeal to the country. Quote, "It is my opinion, based on personal information, that 5,000 people have lost their lives here. Approximately 1/3 of the residents' portion of the city has been swept away. There are several thousand people who are homeless and destitute. How many there is no way of finding out. Arrangements are now being made to have the women and children sent to Houston and other places, but the means of transportation are limited. Thousands are still to be cared for here. We appeal to you for immediate aid." Tuesday night, 90 African American looters were shot in their tracks by citizen guards. One of them was searched and $700 found, together with 4 diamond rings and 2 water-soaked gold watches. The finger of a white woman with a gold band around it was clutched in his hands. In the afternoon, at the suggestion of Colonel Hawley, a mounted squad of 19 men under Adjutant Brokerage was detailed by Major Failings to search a house where African American looters were known to have secreted plunder. Quote, "Shoot them in their tracks, boys. We want no prisoners," said the major. The plunderers changed their location before the arrival of the detachment, however, and the raiders came back empty-handed. 20 cases of looting were reported between 3 and 6 in the evening. At 6 o'clock, a report reached Major Failings that 20 African Americans were robbing a house at 19th and Beach Streets. Quote, "Plant them," commanded the young major, as a half-dozen citizen soldiers led by a corporal mustered before him for orders. Quote, "I want every one of those 20 African Americans dead or alive," said the major. The squad left on the double quick. Half an hour later, they reported 10 of the plunderers killed. The following order by the mayor was posted on the streets at noon of Tuesday. Quote, "To the public, the city of Galveston being under martial law and all good citizens being now enrolled in some branch of the public service, it becomes necessary to preserve the peace, that all arms in the city be placed in the hands of the military. All good citizens are hereby commanded to deliver all arms and ammunition to the city and take Major Failings' receipt." Starting as soon as the water began to recede Sunday morning, a relief party began the work of rescuing the wounded and dying from the ruins of their homes. The scenes presented were almost beyond description. Screaming women, bruised and bleeding, some of them bearing the lifeless forms of children in their arms. Men, broken-hearted and sobbing, bewailing the loss of their wives and children. Streets filled with floating rubbish, among which there were many bodies of the victims of the storm, constituted part of the awful picture. In every direction, as far as the eye could reach, the scene of desolation and destruction continued. It was certainly enough to cause the stoutest heart to quail and grow sick, and yet the searchers well knew they could not unveil 1/100th part of the misery the destructive elements had brought about. They knew also that the full import and heaviness of the blow could not be realized for days to come. Although those in the relief party were prepared to see the natural evidences Following upon the heels of the mighty storm, they did not anticipate such frightful revelations. It was a butchery without precedent, a gathering of victims that was so ghastly as to be beyond the power of any man to picture. As the party went on, the members met others who made reports of things that had come under their notice. There were 50 killed or drowned in one section of town, 100 in another, 500 in another. The list grew larger with each report. It was a matter of wonder and increasing wonder, too, that a single soul escaped to tell the tale. No one seemed entirely sane, for there was madness in the very air. All moved in an atmosphere of gloom. It was difficult to move and breathe with so much death on all sides. Yet no one could keep his eyes off of those horrible, fascinating corpses. They riveted the gaze. Life and death were often so closely intermingled that they could not be told apart. It was the apotheosis of the frightful. Those who had escaped the hurricane and flood were searching for missing dear ones in such a listless way as to irresistibly convey the idea that they did not care whether they found them or not. It was the languor of hopelessness and despair. Some of those who had lost their all were even merry, but it was the glee of insanity. As Sunday morning dawned, the streets were lined with people, half-clad, crippled in every conceivable manner, hobbling as best they could to where they could receive attention of physicians for themselves and summon aid for friends and relatives who could not move. Police officer John Bowie, who had recently been awarded a prize as the most popular officer in the city, was in a pitiable condition. The toes on both of his feet were broken, 2 ribs caved in, and his head badly bruised. But his own condition, he said, was nothing. Quote, "My house, with wife and children, is in the Gulf. I have not a thing on earth for which to live." The houses of all prominent citizens which escaped destruction were turned into hospitals, as were also the leading hotels. There was scarcely one of the houses left standing which did not contain one or more of the dead, as well as many injured. The rain began to pour down in torrents, and the party went back down Tremont Street toward the city. The misery of the poor people, all mangled and hurt, pressing to the city for medical attention, was greatly augmented by the rain. Stopping at a small grocery store to avoid the rain, the party found it packed with injured. The provisions in the store had been ruined, and there was nothing for the numerous customers who came hungry and tired. The place was a hospital, no longer a store. Further down the street, a restaurant, which had been submerged by water, was serving out soggy crackers and cheese to the hungry crowd. That was all that was left. The food was soaked full of water, and the people who were fortunate enough to get those sandwiches were hungry and made no complaint. It was hard to determine what section of the city suffered the greatest damage and loss of life. Information from both the extreme eastern and western portions of the city was difficult to obtain at that time. In fact, it was nearly impossible, but the reports received indicated that those 2 sections had suffered the same fate as the rest of the city, and to a greater degree. Thus the relief party wended its way through streets which but a few hours before were teeming with life. Now they were the thoroughfares of death. It did not seem as if they could ever resound to the throb of quickened vitality again. It seemed as though it would take years to even remove the wreckage. As to rebuilding, it appeared as the work of ages. Annihilation was everywhere. Houston was the great rendezvous for supplies sent to Galveston, and they poured in there by the carload, beginning with Tuesday. The response to the appeal for aid by the people of Galveston on the part of the United States and in fact every country in the world, was prompt and generous. That relief was an absolute necessity was made apparent from the appearance of the refugees who began to flock into Houston as soon as the boats began to run to Galveston after the catastrophe. In addition to these, thousands of strangers arrived also, and the Houston authorities were at a loss as to what to do with them. Some of these visitors were from points far distant who had relatives in the storm-stricken district and had come to learn the worst regarding them. Others there were who had come to volunteer their services in the relief work, but the greatest number consisted of curious sightseers, almost frantic in their efforts to get to the stricken city and feed their eyes on the sickening, repulsive, and disease-breeding scenes. In addition, there were hundreds of the sufferers themselves who had been brought out of their misery to be cared for here. The question of caring for these crowds came up at a mass meeting of the Houston General Relief Committee held Monday. Every incoming train brought scores more of people, and immediate action was necessary. It was decided finally to pitch tents in Emancipation Park, and there as many of the strangers as possible were cared for. The hotels could not accommodate 1/10 of them. First attention, naturally, was given the survivors of the storm. Mayor Brashear sent word to Mayor Jones of Galveston that all persons, no matter who they were, rich or poor, ill or well, should be sent to Houston as soon as possible. They would be well provided for, he said. The urgency of his message for the depopulation of Galveston, he explained, was that until sanitation could be restored in the wrecked city, everybody possible should be sent away. It was estimated that nearly 1,000 of the unfortunate survivors were sent to Houston on Tuesday from Galveston in response to Mayor Brashear's request. Every building in Houston at all habitable was opened to them, and all the seriously ill comfortably housed. The others were made as comfortable as possible, but it was not only food and clothing that was wanted. The only relief some of them sought could not be furnished. They were grieving for lost ones left behind, fathers, mothers, sisters, wives, and children. Nearly everybody had some relative missing, but few of them were certain whether they were dead or alive. All, however, were satisfied that they were dead. Men, bareheaded and barefooted, with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. Women and children, with tattered clothing and bruised arms and faces, and mere infants with bare feet, bruised and swollen, were among the crowds seen on the streets of Houston. Women of wealth and refinement, with hatless heads and gowns of rich material torn into shreds, were among the refugees. At times, a man and his wife, and sometimes with 1 or 2 children, could be seen together, but such sights were infrequent, for nearly all who went to Houston had suffered the loss of one or more of their loved ones. But with all this suffering, there was a marvelous amount of heroism shown. A week before, most of these people had happy homes, and their families were around them. The Tuesday following the disaster, they were homeless, penniless, and with nothing to look forward to. Yet there was scarcely any whimpering or complaining. They walked about the streets as if in a trance. They accepted the assistance offered them with heartfelt thanks, and apparently were greatly relieved at being away from the scenes of sorrow and woe at home. They were all made to feel at home in Houston, that they were welcome, and that everything in the power of the people of Houston would be done for their comfort and welfare, and yet they seemed not to understand half that was said to them. John J. Moody, a member of the committee sent from Houston to take charge of the relief station at Texas City, reported to the mayor of Houston on Tuesday as follows, quote, "To the mayor, sir, on arriving at Lamarck this morning, I was informed that the largest number of bodies was along the coast of Texas City. 56 were buried yesterday, and today within less than 2 miles, extending opposite this place and toward Virginia City. It is yet 6 miles farther to Virginia City, and the bodies are thicker where we are now than where they have been buried. A citizen inspecting in the opposite direction reports dead bodies thick for 20 miles. The residents of this place have lost all, not a habitable building left, and they have been too busy disposing of the dead to look after personal affairs. Those who have anything left are giving it to the others, and yet there is real suffering. I have given away nearly all the bread I brought for our own use to hungry children. A number of helpless women and beggared children were landed here from Galveston this afternoon, and no place to go and not a bite to eat. Tomorrow, others are expected from the same place. Every 10 feet along the wreck-lined coast tells of acts of vandalism, not a trunk, valise, or tool chest, but what has been rifled. We buried a woman this afternoon whose finger bore the mark of a recently removed ring." Unquote. The United States government furnished several thousand tents for the Houston camp, which was under the supervision of the United States Marine Hospital authorities. Quote, "I fear Galveston is destroyed beyond its ability to recover," unquote, is the manner in which Quartermaster Baxter concluded his report September 12th to the War Department at Washington. He recommended the continuance of his office only long enough to recover the office safes and close up accounts, and declared all government works were wrecked, so restoration was impossible. This gloomy prophecy for the city's future was reflected in an official report to Governor Sayers of Texas by ex-State Treasurer Wortham, who spent a day at Galveston investigating the situation. His statement claimed that 75% of the city was demolished and gives little hope for rebuilding. Quote, "Great piles of human bodies, dead animals, rotting vegetation, household furniture, and fragments of the houses themselves are piled in confused heaps right in the main streets of the city. Along the Gulf front, human bodies are floating around like cordwood. Intermingled with them are to be found the carcasses of horses, chickens, dogs, and rotting vegetable matter. Above all arises the foulest stench that ever emanated from any cesspool, absolutely sickening in its intensity and most dangerous to health in its effects. Along the strand adjacent to the Gulf front, where are located all the big wholesale warehouses and stores, the situation is even worse. Great stores of fresh vegetation have been invaded by the incoming waters and are now turned into garbage piles of most befouling odors. The Gulf waters, while on the land, played at will with everything, smashing in doors of stores, depositing bodies of humans where they pleased, and then receded, leaving the wreckage to tell its own tale of how the work had been done. As a result, the great warehouses are tombs, wherein are to be found the dead bodies of human beings and carcasses, almost defying the efforts of relief parties. Quote, "In the pile of debris along the street, in the water, and scattered throughout the residence portion of the city are to be found masses of wreckage, and in these great piles are to be found more human bodies and household furniture of every description. Handsome pictures are seen lying alongside of the ice cream freezers and resting beside the nude figure of some man or woman. These great masses of debris are not confined to any one particular section of the city. Quote, "The waters of the Gulf and the winds spared no one who was exposed. Whirling houses around in its grasp, the wind piled their shattered frames high in confusing masses and dumped their contents on top. Men and women were thrown around like so many logs of wood and left to rot in the withering sun. I believe that with the best exertions of the men, it will require weeks to secure some semblance of physical order in the city, and it is doubtful, even then, if all the debris will be disposed of. I never saw such a wreck in my life. From the Gulf front to the center of the island, from the ocean back, the storm wave left death and destruction in its wake. There is hardly a family on the island whose household is not short a member or more, and in some instances, entire families have been washed away or killed. Hundreds who escaped from the waves did so only to become victims of a worse death by being crushed by falling buildings. Quote, down in the business portion of the city, the foundations of great buildings have given way, carrying towering structures to their ruin. These ruins, falling across the streets, formed barricades on which gathered all the floating debris and many human bodies. Many of these bodies were stripped of their clothing by the force of the water and the wind, and there was nothing to protect them from the scorching sun, the millions of flies, and the rapid invasion of decomposition that set in. Many of the bodies have decayed so rapidly that they could not be handled for burial. Some of the most conservative men on the island place the loss of human beings at not less than 7,500 and possibly 10,000, while others say it will not exceed 5,000. Unquote. Pestilence could only be avoided here by cremation. That was the order of the day. Human corpses, dead animals, and all debris were therefore to be submitted to the flames. On Thursday, upwards of 400 bodies, mostly women and children, were cremated, and the work went rapidly on. They were gathered in heaps of 20 and 40 bodies, saturated with kerosene and the torch applied. On Thursday, September 13th, trainload after trainload of provisions, clothing, disinfectants, and medicines were lined up at Texas City, 6 miles from Galveston, all sent to the suffering survivors of the storm-swept city. Across the bay were thousands of people, friends of the dead and living, waiting for news of the missing ones and an opportunity to help, but only a meager amount of relief had at that time reached the stricken town. 2 telegraph wires had been put up and partial communication restored to let the outside world know the conditions there were far more horrible than was at first supposed. That was about all. It was not that which was needed. It was a more practicable connection with the mainland. True, more boats had been pressed into service to carry succor to the suffering, and the suffering to succor. But they were few and small, and although working diligently night and day, the service was inadequate in the extreme, and the people were still suffering, the sick dying for want of medicine and care, the well growing desperate, and in many cases gradually losing their reason. Every effort was put forth to reach the dying first, but all sorts of obstacles were encountered, because many of them were so badly maimed and wounded that they were unable to apply to the relief committees, and the latter were so burdened by the great number of direct applications that they were unable to send out messengers. The situation grew worse every minute. Everything was needed for man and beast: disinfectants, prepared foods, hay, grain, and especially water and ice. Scores more of people died that day as a result of inattention, and many more were on the verge of dissolution, for at best it was to be many days before a train could be run into the city, and the only hope was the arrival of more boats to transport the goods. The Relief Committee held a meeting and decided that armed men were needed to assist in burying the dead and clear the wreckage, and arrangements were made to fill this demand. There were plenty of volunteers for this work, but an insufficiency of arms. The proposition of trying to pay for work was rejected by the committee, and it was decided to go ahead impressing men into service, issuing orders for rations only to those who worked or were unable to work. Word was received that refugees would be carried from the city to Houston free of charge. An effort was made to induce all who were able to leave to go, because the danger of pestilence was frightfully apparent. There was any number willing to depart, and each outgoing boat, after having unloaded its provisions, were filled with people. The safety of the living was a paramount consideration, and the actions of the railroads in offering to carry refugees free of charge greatly relieved the situation. The workers had their hands full in any event, and the nurses and physicians also, for neglect, although unavoidable, often resulted in the death of many. It was estimated $2.5 million would be needed for the relief work. The banks of Galveston subscribed $10,000, but personal losses of the citizens of Galveston had been so large that very few were able to subscribe anything. The confiscation of all foodstuffs held by wholesale grocers and others was decided upon early in the day by the Relief Committee. Starvation would inevitably ensue unless the supply was dealt out with great care. All kerosene oil was gone, and the gas works and electric lights were destroyed. The committee asked for a shipload of kerosene oil, a shipload of drinking water, and tons of disinfectants, such as lime and formaldehyde, for immediate use, and money and food next. Not a tallow candle could be bought for gold, or light of any kind procured. What was there to do with? Everything was gone in the way of ovens and utensils. It was absolutely necessary to let the outside world know the true state of things. The city was unable to help itself. In fact, a great part of the mighty, noble state of Texas was prostrate. Even the country at large was paralyzed at the sense of the magnitude of the disaster, and was, for the time being, powerless to do anything. The entire world was thrilled with alarm, it being instinctively felt that the worst had not yet been made known. 25,000 people had to be clothed and fed for many weeks, and many thousands supplied with household goods as well. Much money was required to make their residences even fit to live in. During the first few days after the disaster, it was almost beyond possibility to make any estimate of the amount of money necessary to even temporarily relieve the sufferings of the unfortunate people. Galveston began September 14th to emerge from the valley of the shadow of death into which she had been plunged for nearly a week, and on that day, for the first time, actual progress was made toward clearing up the city. The bodies of those killed and drowned in the storm had for the most part been disposed of. A large number was found when the debris was removed from wrecked buildings, but on that date there were no corpses to be seen save those occasionally cast up by the sea. As far as sight, at least, was concerned, the city was cleared of its dead. They had been burned, thrown into the water, buried. Anything to get them quickly out of sight. The chief danger of pestilence was due almost entirely to the large number of unburied cattle lying upon the island, whose decomposing carcasses polluted the air to an almost unbearable extent. This, however, was not in the city proper, but was a condition prevailing on the outskirts of Galveston. One great trouble heretofore had been the inability to organize gangs of laborers for the purpose of clearing the streets. The situation in the stricken city on Wednesday, September 12th, was horrible indeed. Men, women, and children were dying for want of food, and scores went insane from the terrible strain to which they had been subjected. It was estimated that fully 2.5 million would be necessary to carry the sufferers through the fall and winter and into the following spring, for thousands of them were ill and unable to provide in any way for themselves. There were fully 50,000 men, women, and children in Galveston and central and southern Texas who were dependent upon charity. On Friday night, Governor Sayers decided upon two important plans of action. The first was that he would allow all food and clothing shipped from the east and west to be concentrated in Galveston for the use of that city, and that he would also grant that city the use of 30,000 laborers for a period of 30 days, the same to be paid $1.50 per man per day for that time out of the relief fund. In addition thereto, all requests for money from the Galveston Relief Committee were to be granted. His second decision was that he personally would look after the needs of the 30,000 destitute along the Gulf Coast on the mainland, provide them with flour and bacon, and keep them going until they could get on their feet again. Chairman Seeley of the Galveston Committee was to keep track of the Galveston situation while the governor looked out for the outside points. That night, a local committee from Galveston was sent to Houston and Virginia Point to take charge of the receiving and distribution of supplies that arrived there for the Galveston people. A serious matter confronting the authorities not only at the coast points but in the cities near Galveston was the rapid gathering of toughs, gamblers, and rough characters generally, which after the flood were forced to leave Galveston Island as they would not work. Others drifted into the mainland opposite Galveston and on to the neighboring towns by the hundreds in the hope of pickpocketing and the like among the crowds. All this gathering of disorderly characters made the peace officers rather uneasy as to the future. The police and troops in Galveston and the special officers on the mainland were constantly on the alert to keep down trouble and prevent all possible thieving, and they did not get the upper hand of this element until they had shot a score or more. These fellows would steal the provisions and supplies sent by the generous people from the outside, and whenever caught, were shot without delay. Fully 1,500 bodies were cremated at Galveston after it became apparent that the time necessary to bury them or cast them into the sea could not be taken owing to their advanced state of decomposition. Many of the African Americans who handled the bodies fell from fright and nausea. White volunteers took their places and the work went on. The volunteers bandaged their mouths and noses with cotton cloths saturated with disinfectants and were relieved by other volunteers every hour. Fires could not be started every place where bodies were found. The usual plan was to collect all bodies within 2 blocks in one spot and then build a funeral pyre. On the remains of many women were valuable rings and jewelry, but the men did not attempt to remove the jewelry. It was burned with the owners. Officers Mass and Woodward reported that their 2 gangs burned 100 bodies, the majority women and children. The percentage of deaths among children was frightful. Sheriff Thomas and his African Americans burned 40 bodies on the beach near Tremont Street. Catholic priests in charge of gangs reported 120 bodies burned. The sanitary experts pushed the work of burning the dead. No other disposition was considered. People who had lost relatives and friends made no objection and looked on the plan with favor. Disinfectants were used as never before in the world. The smell of the charnel house was driven away, and the whole city was filled with the fumes of carbolic acid and lime in solution. The miracles of Galveston were many. Some of them will not be received with full credit. In the infirmary at Houston was a boy whose name is Rudder. He was found on Monday morning lying behind a trunk on the land near the town of Hitchcock, which is 20 miles to the northward of Galveston. The boy was only 12 years old. His story was that his father, mother, and 2 children remained in the house. There was a crash. The house went to pieces. The boy said he caught hold of a trunk when he found himself in the water and floated off with it. He was sure the others were drowned. He had no idea of where it took him, but when daylight came, he was across the bay and out upon the still partially submerged mainland. Houston was the center of relief distribution and also the key to Galveston. It was practically the only way in or out for weeks. Hundreds of refugees passed through every day. Houston was well filled with them, but the larger number went right through to points farther north. Free transportation was provided to any point in Texas, provided they had relatives who would take care of them. Many of the refugees arrived in Houston scantily clothed and in a pitiful condition. Vast as the work is, all are being provided for, said Edward Watkins, chairman of the Transportation Division of the Relief Committee. Quote, "We have not let anybody go through uncared for." Mere curiosity was at a discount here. People who had urgent business in Galveston found it hard to get permits to go there, and those who were simply curious could not get there at all. Camera fiends were absolutely barred. One man was shot for taking a picture of a nude woman on the beach, and 3 newspapermen who were taking views of the ruins were rounded up, their cameras smashed, and themselves forced to go to work gathering up decomposed corpses. Even Houston was in a similar state of martial law. Guards surrounded the depot of the International and Great Northern, the only road running south, and would not even allow curious crowds to gather to see the refugees come in. This was in enforcement of a proclamation issued by Mayor Brashear, copies of which, printed on large red cards, were posted conspicuously all over the city. The catastrophe all but paralyzed shipping businesses in the storm-visited section. At Fort Worth, all purchasing stopped. Cotton was just beginning to move, but it had to go by way of New Orleans, the additional freights eating up the apparent profit of the 1 cent a pound advance in price. Had the storm struck a few weeks later, the loss would have been greatly increased, as the cotton would then have been upon the wharves. Bodies which lay exposed in the streets and which were necessary to remove somewhere lest they be stepped on were carried into a temporary morgue until 500 lay in rows on the floor. Then a problem in mortality such as no other American community ever faced was presented. Pestilence, which stalked forth by Monday, seemed about to take possession of what the storm had left. Immediate disposition of those bodies was absolutely necessary to save the living. Then it was that Lowe and McVitie and Seeley and the others, who by common impulse had come together to deal with the problem. The longshoreman took up the most gruesome task ever seen away from a battlefield. He had to have helpers. Some volunteers, others were pressed into the service at the point of a bayonet. Whiskey by the bucketful was carried to these men, and they were drenched with it. The stimulant was kept at hand and applied continuously. Only in this way was it possible for the stoutest hearted to work in such surroundings. Under the direction of Hughes, these hundreds of bodies, already collected and others brought from the central part of the city, those which were quickest found, were loaded onto an ocean barge and taken far off into the Gulf to be cast into the sea. Hundreds of people became insane during the week succeeding the flood. They had bravely borne the loss of relatives, the hunger and fatigue, had apparently been unmindful of the horrors of the catastrophe, and had, as a rule, given no indications of mental aberration while the disaster was on. But when the danger was past and relief from the great strain came, the overburdened mind gave way. J. A. Fernandez, a prominent citizen of Galveston, who was connected with the relief work, told of many cases which came under his observation. The second Sunday following the storm, September 16th, he said in recounting his experiences, "There are at least 500 persons there whose minds have become unbalanced, and some have lost every vestige of their mental faculties, there being some raving maniacs among them, one of whom came under my personal observation. His name is Charles Thompson, a gardener. He occupied a room above me at the hotel, and during the night he kept raving and pacing the floor and kept calling on God to witness his action, continually invoking the mercy of the deity. He has lost his family and home, and by a miracle saved himself. Quote, as soon as he was out of personal danger on that awful night, he commenced rescuing women and children and saved 70 people, according to a gentleman who knew the circumstances. He then lost his mind. He created so much excitement at the hotel, the 2 policemen were detained to capture him. He heard them approaching and leaped out of a 3-story window to an adjoining building. His fall was somewhat broken, but his body struck a bay window in my room. He was badly injured, but continued his mad flight. He baffled his pursuers and escaped. This occurred at 5 o'clock this morning. This is only one illustration of the conditions that prevail there. Quote, a man whose wife was drowned in the flood had been searching in vain for her remains for several days, and yesterday located the body in the water near 33rd Street and Avenue G. Soldiers had also seen the body, and they took it in charge. He protested and rushed to take possession of the body. The soldiers were stern and had to discharge their duty, and the husband, practically demented, was bound while the body was thrown in the flames and soon burned to a crisp. The man made frantic efforts to get away from the soldiers, but to no avail. Quote, in the course of my rounds, I saw a family of 6 half naked, and they appeared crazy, and would look into the face of every stranger with a vacant stare that was pitiable in the extreme. They were hurrying in the direction of the places where provisions were being distributed. They had lost their homes and had only the clothing on their backs. There were thousands in a similar condition. Unquote. Thompson, a young man who was very active in saving life during the night of the storm, became insane because of the awful scenes he witnessed. Thompson's friends first noticed his condition when he told them that one of the persons he rescued had deposited $10,000 in one of the Galveston banks to his credit, and that he was going to live in luxury the rest of his life. Thompson retired to his room on the 3rd floor of the Washington Hotel Saturday night, seemingly sane. Soon afterward, he became violent. The person engaged to watch him was compelled to leave the room for a short time, and when he returned, found Thompson had wrenched the shutters off his window and leaped out upon an awning and thence to the street. He was seen running toward the bay, and in all probability threw himself in and was drowned. Another case was that of a young woman who was caught in the storm, and with 2 other women and about 50 men and boys found refuge in an office. As the storm gradually subsided, the young woman started for her home quite reassured. She found a wild waste of waters sweeping over the site of her home. Among the first victims carried into the temporary morgue were the young woman's mother, brother, and 2 children. These were quickly followed by her brother's wife and her 2 sisters. The shock overthrew the girl's reason, and she became a nervous wreck without a relative in the world. The Ursuline Convent and Academy, in charge of the Sisters of St. Angelo, proved a haven of refuge for nearly 1,000 homeless and storm-driven unfortunates. No one was refused admittance to the sheltering institution. African Americans and whites were taken in without question, and the asylum was thrown open to all who sought its protecting wings. In the midst of the storm, the hundreds or more African Americans grew wild and shouted and sang in true camp meeting style until the nerves of the other refugees were shattered and a panic seemed imminent. It was then that Mother Superioress Joseph rang the chancel bell and caused a hush of the pandemonium. When quiet had been restored, the mother addressed the African Americans and told them that it was no time nor place for such scenes, that if they wanted to pray, they should do so from their hearts, and the Creator of all things would hear their offerings above the roar of the hurricane, which raged with increased fury as she spoke to the awe-stricken assemblage. The African Americans listened attentively, and when the mother told them that all those who wished to be baptized and resign themselves to God could do so, nearly every one of them asked that the sacrament be administered. The panic had been precipitated by the falling of the north wall of that section of the building, in which the African Americans had sought refuge. Order and silent prayer were brought about by the nuns' determination and presence of mind. Families that had been separated by the conflict of elements were united by the waters of the Gulf, tossing them into this haven of refuge. Heart-moving scenes were presented by these unions as the half-dead, mangled, and bruised unfortunates were rescued and dragged from the waters by the more fortunate members of their families. The academy was to have opened for the fall session on Tuesday, and 42 boarding scholars from all parts of the state had arrived at the convent, preparatory to resuming their studies on that date. The community of nuns comprised 40 sisters, and they too were there administering cheer and mercy to the sufferers, many of whom were more dead than alive when brought into the shelter. Within this religious home and in the cells of the nuns, 4 babies came into this world during that dark night. Mother Joseph, in speaking of the incidents of the night within the convent walls, said that she believed it was the first time in the history of the world that a baby had been born in the nun's cell of a convent. They were christened, for no one expected to live to see the light of day, and it was voted that these babes should not leave the world they had just entered without baptism, and regardless of the religious belief of the parents, the little ones were baptized. Mr. Prutzman said, quote, "The reports from Galveston are not half as appalling as the situation really is. We left the fated city Wednesday afternoon, going by boat to Texas City and by rail to Houston. The condition of Galveston at that time, while showing an improvement, was awful, and never shall I forget the terrible scenes that met our eyes as the boat on which we left steamed out of the harbor. There were bodies on all sides of us. In some places, they were piled 6 and 7 deep, and the stench was horrible. I resided with my family at 718 19th Street. This is 14 blocks away from the beach, yet my house was swept away at 5 p.m. Saturday, and with it went everything we had in the world. 15 minutes before, I took my wife and children to the courthouse, and we were saved, along with about 1,000 others who sought refuge there. When we went through the streets, the water was up to our arms, and we carried the children on our heads. I assisted for several days in the work of rescue. In one pile of debris, we found a woman who seemed to have escaped the flood, but who was injured and pinned down so she could not escape. A guard came along, and after failing to rescue her, deliberately shot her to end her misery. Quote, "The streets present a gruesome appearance. Every available wagon and vehicle in the city is being used to transport the dead, and it is no uncommon thing to see a load of bodies 10 deep. The stench in the city is nauseating. Since the flood, the only water that could be used for drinking purposes was in cisterns, and it has become tainted with the slime and filth that covers the city until it is little better than no water at all. Since the city was placed under martial law, conditions have been much better and there is little lawlessness. The soldiers have shown no quarter and have orders to shoot on sight. This has had a wonderful effect on the disreputable characters who have flocked into the city." Quote, "Everybody who remains in Galveston is made to work, and the punishment for a refusal is about the same as that meted out to ghouls. I saw 4 African American men shot in one day. There were confined in the hold of a steamer in the harbor 6 African American men who were found by the soldiers with a flour sack almost filled with fingers and ears on which were jewels. These men probably have been publicly executed before this time. In the work of rescue, we found whole families tied together with ropes, and in several instances, mothers had their babies clasped in their arms. Scores of unfortunates straggle into Houston every day, and their condition is pitiable. Several have lost their reason. The citizens of Houston are doing all in their power to meet the demands of the sufferers, and every available building in the city has been converted into a hospital. When we arrived in Houston, we scarcely had clothes enough to cover us, and the citizens fitted us out and started us north. The fear of fever or some awful plague drove us from Galveston. Already speculators are flocking into the city, and there is some activity among them over tax title real estate. In several instances, whole families were wiped out of existence, and the opportunities in this line seem to be great." Unquote. Galveston received another scare Sunday night, the 16th, when it became rumored that Houston, where all the relief trains were sidetracked, was burning with its precious supplies of food and clothing. The scare grew out of a $400,000 fire in Houston, which destroyed the Merchants and Planters oil mill, the largest in the world. The fire broke out at noon, but was not observable until nightfall, when the glow in the sky could be seen for a great distance. Galveston was assured by telegraph that a second southern Texas calamity was out of the question, and that the relief supplies were safe. One feature of the efforts to relieve the people of Galveston was a delay in getting supplies to the island city. Trainload after trainload was in Houston, which would have assisted materially in the work of relief, but on account of the limited transportation facilities, they could not be hurried there. There was but one track, and it was of light rails and was used only for terminal business. Even if the supplies were at Texas City, they could not be moved fast, as there was not enough boats of light draft at Galveston. Buffalo Bayou could be used from Houston, but it was impossible to get the boats for the purpose. Arrangements were completed by the Santa Fe Road, September 17th, whereby it established a barge line to Galveston from Virginia Point. This helped somewhat in getting relief supplies from the mainland. Clara Barton, head of the Red Cross League, arrived at Galveston that day. Captain W.A. Hutchins, superintendent of the Galveston Life-Saving Station, returned from a trip along the island and reported that he saw a great many bodies. He said that the life-saving crew at San Luis had taken from the beach 181 bodies and buried them at different points along the island. 3/4 of the people who applied for relief were mentally dull. The physicians said with proper care, most of them might be cured. A young girl was brought into the General Relief Station in Galveston on Friday night. The Relief Corps found her huddled up in an empty freight car, laughing and singing to amuse herself. The doctors said food and care were all she needed to restore her to reason. It was over a week after the flood before those from the outside really began to find out what the awful calamity was to the people in the desolated city. The first shock was wearing off. The long lists of dead and missing were getting to be an old story, and the sick and suffering were crawling into places of refuge. Some of them had been sleeping on the open prairies ever since the storm. Most of them, in fact, men with broken arms and legs, sick women and ailing children. They would crawl out of the wreck of their homes and lie down on the bare ground to die. Relief parties found such as these every day and brought them into the hospitals as fast as possible. One relief party found 5,000 people in the vicinity of Galveston, homeless, helpless, hopeless, and tearless. It was a sight to cause a stone statue to weep. They only say 5,000 dead. It would be more like 10,000. Quote, "I know I am right," the witness said. "Everyone in Galveston talks of 12,000, 15,000, and 18,000 dead, but it would be 10,000 at the very least." Quote, "I believe the worst sight I witnessed was the 2,800 bodies being carried out to sea and buried in the Gulf. Huge barges were tied at the wharves and loaded with the unknown dead. As fast as one barge was filled, it made its way out from the shore, and weighting the bodies, men cast them into the water." Quote, "Oh, those eyes," she cried, "that I might put them from my mind. I can see those little children, mere babies, go floating by my place of refuge, dead, dead. God alone knows the suffering I went through. Thousands, yes, thousands of poor souls were carried over the brink of death in the twinkling of an eye, and I saw it all." Unquote. The people of Galveston had seen so much death that they were temporarily hardened to it. The announcement of the loss of another friend meant little to a man who had seen the dead bodies of his neighbors and townspeople hauled to the wharf by the dray load. No services were attempted for the dead until nearly a month had passed. Neither were there memorial services. The city rapidly improved in its sanitary conditions. The smell from the ooze and mud with which most of the streets were filled was stronger 10 days after the tragedy than that which came from the debris heaps containing undiscovered bodies. When these heaps were being burned and the wind carried the smoke over the city, the odor was very similar to that which afflicts Chicago at night when refuse is being burned at the stockyards, and no worse. Soon even the odor of the slime was gone. Every dump cart in the city was at work. Every Galveston businessman talked confidently of the future of the city, though many of the clerks announced their intention of going away as soon as they can accumulate money enough. Quote, "I am not afraid of another storm," said a clerk in one of the principal stores, "but I'm sick and tired of the whole business." Unquote. William Guest, a Pullman car porter, returned to Chicago from the storm-stricken district Monday, September 17. He said, quote, "I left Harrisburg night before last, and things then in the neighborhood were in a dreadful state. Galveston is about 20 miles distant, and the refugees were pouring in the direction of Houston in great numbers. Many well-to-do African Americans have lost all they had. The Reverend W. H. Kane, an African American Episcopal minister, and his entire family were killed, and it was reported to me that Mrs. Cuney, the widow of Wright Cuney, was also lost, as well as a number of African American teachers employed in the public schools. At Houston, relief committees have been organized." Unquote. The Reverend Mr. Kane was well known in Chicago, having preached several times from the pulpit of the St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Dearborn near 30th Street. Cyrus Field Adams, publisher of The Appeal, Chicago, received a letter from Galveston from W. H. Noble, Jr., saying that about 1,500 African Americans lost their lives in the storm and that fully 10,000 were homeless. Miss Clara Barton, head of the Red Cross Society, wrote of the situation at Galveston on September 18th. Quote, "It would be difficult to exaggerate the awful scene that meets the visitors everywhere. The situation could not be exaggerated. Probably the loss of life will exceed any estimate that has been made. In those parts of the city where destruction was the greatest, there still must be hundreds of bodies under the debris. At the end of the island first struck by the storm, and which was swept clean of every vestige of the splendid residences that covered it, the ruin is enclosed by a towering wall of debris, under which many bodies are buried. The removal of this has scarcely even begun." Quote, "The story that will be told when this mountain of ruins is removed may multiply the horrors of the fearful situation. As usual in great calamities, the people are dazed and speak of their losses with an unnatural calmness that would astonish those who do not understand it. I do believe there is danger of an epidemic, but the nervous strain upon the people as they come to realize their condition may be nearly as fatal. They talk of friends that are gone, with tearless eyes, making no allusion to the loss of property. A professional gentleman who called upon me this afternoon, a gentleman of splendid human sympathies and refinement, wore a soiled black flannel shirt without a coat, and in apologizing for his appearance, said in the most casual, light-hearted way, "Excuse my appearance, I have just come in from burying the dead." Quote, "But these people will break down under this strain, and the Red Cross is glad of the force of strong, competent workers which it has brought to their relief. Portions of the business part of the city escaped the greatest severity of the storm and are left partially intact. Thus it is possible to purchase here nearly all the supplies that may be wanting. Still, the Galveston merchants should be given the benefit of home demands. Mayor Jones has offered to the Red Cross as headquarters the best building at his disposal. Relief is coming as rapidly as the crippled transportation facilities will admit. No one need fear, After seeing the brave and manly way in which these people are helping themselves, that too much outside aid will be given. In reply to the question, what is the most needed? I would say the most immediate needs are surgical dressings, the ordinary medical remedies, and delicacies for the sick." Unquote. It was given out from Galveston on Tuesday, September 20th, that so far as could be ascertained on that date, the loss of life in the Great Catastrophe was as follows. Identified, 4,754. Unidentified recovered bodies, 300. Missing, 2,000. Total, 7,054. Dead in Central and Southern Texas, 1,044. High Island, 563. Total, 1,607. This makes the grand total of dead 8,661. The horrifying news reached Dallas late on the afternoon of September 18 that High Island, a seaside resort 30 miles northeast of Galveston, near the Gulf Shore and in the southwestern corner of Jefferson County, Texas, was entirely destroyed by the hurricane. The place had about 1,000 residents, many of them visitors. Not a house was left standing, and more than 400 dead bodies were found by relief and exploring parties. Estimates of the number dead was dependent upon the relief committees. Mayor Jones made it about 8,000, while other authorities put the number as high as 15,000. In the business center, the streets had been cleaned and opened. All buildings still showed marks of wind and water, but goods were displayed and business was being transacted. The city was gradually assuming the bustling, anti-flood appearance. The principal streets were electrically lighted. Stenches no longer assailed the nostrils, except in the outside circle of destruction, where much debris still remained untouched. Cremation of the dead was being pushed, but it was many days before the working parties got out the last of the bodies. Building material was needed at Galveston, but its delivery was necessarily slow, owing to the lack of rail communication with the mainland. There were still many pitiable cases of destitution. Many half-demented persons positively refused to leave their wrecked homes, and as persistently refused to accept offers of relief extended them. In several instances, parents who had lost children still occupied ruins of their former home, and the surroundings had brought them to a state of mental and physical collapse. The number who had gone insane as a result of their experiences will probably never be known. In every lot of refugees sent out of the stricken city, there were many insane men and women. The victims first made light of their losses and laughed immoderately when telling of the death of relatives in the flood. It was a very short step from this to uncontrollable madness. Gruesome scenes and soul-harrowing incidents of the time immediately following the Great Hail in Galveston were graphically portrayed in a letter from a young woman caught on the island in the awful storm. It was written by Miss Nellie Carey to her parents, who live at 5408 Lake Avenue, Chicago. Miss Carey had been home on a vacation for several weeks and left Chicago for Galveston the Tuesday evening before the hurricane, reaching the doomed city just in time to participate in the terrible experience. Her letter follows, quote, Galveston, Wednesday, September 12th. Dearest parents, have not had a minute to write and cannot collect my thoughts to tell you of the horrible disaster down here. Thousands of dead in the streets, the Gulf and Bay strewn with dead bodies, the whole island demolished, not a drop of water, food scarce. If help does not reach us soon, there will be great starvation for everybody. The dead are not being identified at all. They throw them on drays and take them to barges, where they are loaded like cordwood and taken out to sea to be cast into the waves, now peaceful, which were so hungry for them in their anger. I was at the wharf this morning for a short time and saw 3 barges loaded with their gruesome freight. The bodies are frightful, everyone nearly nude. God alone knows who they are. The bay is full of dead cattle and horses, together with human corpses. blistering in the hot sun. It will be impossible to remove the dead from the debris for weeks. The whole island is frightful. I saw 38 bodies taken from one house. Everyone is striving to get the bodies buried for fear of the plague. I never expected to get out alive, but thank God not one of us was killed. We were driven back to the stairs and up stair by the great waves. The wind was blowing over 100 miles an hour, and the rain fell in torrents. Never shall I forget the sight as darkness settled upon us. I thought of you, Papa and Mama, and prayed that you might be comforted. Our roof is now gone. The walls have fallen around us, but we still have a floor, and, I can't tell you, it is too horrible. I was nearly drowned getting home from the office at 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Whitman is almost crazy and is in a dangerous condition. I have lost everything. I'm now wearing clothes borrowed from those who are more fortunate. The stench is terrible. Thousands of horses and cattle without owners are in the most pitiable condition imaginable. Not a drop of water for them to drink since Saturday morning. And the people, I wonder that everybody is not mad at the horrors. No account can exaggerate it. It is absolutely necessary that everybody in the United States do what they can. Nearly all our help at Clark and Courts are drowned. Mr. Honsinger, his whole family, our other bookkeeper, and a number of the girls. The town is under martial law to protect it from the mob. Last night, an African American was arrested with 10 fingers in his pockets with valuable rings on them. Mr. Failing at our house is in command of the protective force. They have had to shoot many to keep the horrible ghouls in control. Eddie Rogers is next in command and is doing noble work. I have done what I could to help the dying and wounded. We were on the highest point of ground in Galveston. That is all that saved us. For blocks and blocks, reaching into miles, not a house remains, not a building, but is completely demolished. Houses just torn board from board and piled up. I have climbed over wreckage 40 feet high in the streets to get to places. I think we were more fortunate than anyone else in town. I think not one was killed, though our escape was narrow. With the exception of Mrs. Whitman, all were calm, though I reckon everybody quaked inside. I know I did. Thursday, am well. Had something to eat this morning and a little rainwater. Coffee is plenty, but water scarce. Today the flesh slips off the bodies as they take hold to drag them from the ruins. They are piling them in great heaps now and burning them. The horrors multiply. I have seen men shot down in the streets by the soldiers. The stench is untold. Last night, the awful smell kept us awake, although we were utterly exhausted. It fills your throat and mouth and makes your head ache so. The horrible experiences it will take years to tell and more than a lifetime to forget. If you could be here, you would feel that your anxiety was nothing. It is so pitiable to see husbands with a look of despair in their eyes, searching for their wives and children, wives for their loved ones, and most pitiable of all, the comparatively few children, although they are enough, God knows, to be left orphans and homeless, looking into everyone's face with frightened, appealing eyes. It is heartrending. Now, I am much better off. I am safe, so please don't worry. I hope to hear from you soon. Best love and kisses to both, from Nellie." Unquote. When the relief train reached Virginia Point, which is on the mainland opposite Galveston, it was found that of those who survived the flood and hurricane, the majority was severely injured. Most of them were bruised and maimed, presenting a pitiful sight, their limbs lacerated and bleeding. All bemoaned the fate of those dear to them. Many of the dead, and the beach was strewn with corpses, had their faces and heads mutilated so that it was impossible to learn the names of those who found their last resting place in the crude graves hurriedly dug. A headboard was placed on the grave in every instance, giving as nearly as possible age and accurate description. It was found necessary in many instances to bury 3 and 4 in one grave. Those who survived the wreck were homeless and had had nothing to eat since Saturday. As most of them were injured, it was not possible for them to organize a movement on their part. Life sustenance was furnished these survivors in order that they might not swell the list of the dead. Most of the bodies were found in and around the vicinity of Virginia Point, were supposed to have been washed inland from Galveston. Galveston's destruction, and that of other towns similarly situated, had been predicted. Writing in The Arena in 1890, Professor Joseph Rhodes Buchanan said, quote, "Every seaboard city south of New England that is not more than 50 feet above the sea level of the Atlantic coast is destined to a destructive convulsion. Galveston, Narlands, Mobile, St. Augustine, Savannah, and Charleston are doomed. Richmond, Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, Newark, Jersey City, and New York will suffer in various degrees in proportion as they approximate the sea level. Brooklyn will suffer less, but the destruction at New York and Jersey City will be the grandest horror. The actual number of lives lost at Galveston will never be known, but over 4,500 bodies of victims of the frightful catastrophe were identified, and these, together with the hundreds of identified and unidentified corpses which were buried at sea, in the sands along the beach, in the yards and grounds of private residences, those bodies which must have been carried out into the Gulf when the waters receded from the island Sunday morning, those cremated, the hundreds found on the Gulf Coast, on the shores of Galveston Bay, and those taken from the water, and finally those discovered in all sorts of places inland. The bodies found outside Galveston Island being buried were picked up. All these served to swell the Galveston death list to possibly 7,000, which was a figure named by Mayor Jones the 5th day after the flood. He had every opportunity for obtaining information on this point. Until the cremation of bodies began, the foremen of the various burial gangs made lists of the bodies disposed of by their men. But when it became necessary to burn the corpses, the danger of pestilence being so great that they had to be put out of the way at the earliest possible moment, the compilation of these lists was abandoned and a mere general estimate made. The work of clearing the business and residence streets proceeded but slowly, the men in the gangs assigned to this being enervated by the intense heat of the sun, sickened by the effluvia from the decomposing bodies of dead human beings and animals, and depressed by the gloomy character of their surroundings. Most of the men thus employed were citizens of Galveston, many of whom were in comfortable circumstances before the storm swept away their belongings. In the majority of cases, these workers had lost not only their earthly possessions, but members of their immediate families as well, and were heartsore and crushed in spirit. In the main, they engaged in this work because they wanted to help the city out of its desperate straits, and for the further reason that if not busied in mind and body, they might possibly go mad. The end.